In the next few moments, I'd like to give you a bit of background concerning textbooks that I've selected for our study of the Old Testament. Certainly, primary and foundational will be the use of a modern language translation of the Old Testament. I leave some latitude to you as student to select one you'd like to work with. I only ask that it be a newer translation, something such as New American Standard, NIV, New Revised Standard, or some that are even more contemporary. We want to stay away from paraphrases for the purposes of our careful study, although paraphrases have their place for more relaxed reading of Scripture. As to secondary resources, the first I'd like to introduce is by Walter Breuggemann, An Introduction to the Old Testament, the Canon and Christian Imagination. The particular revision that we have here was assisted by Todd Linnefelt, so he is listed as a co-author. He's actually one of Breuggemann's students. Here's the reason that I've selected this particular textbook. What I like about Breuggemann's contribution is he is a brilliant thinker, he is a broad thinker, he is a committed Christian, he is interested in making sure that we connect the truths of the Old Testament with our lives, and yet he doesn't sacrifice scholarship in order to get there. He doesn't just quickly go for an application. He rather thinks deeply and broadly. He thinks globally. He helps me a great deal in this regard, and I think you will find him challenging as well. Now, admittedly, there'll be some places where I will differ with him. Likely you will differ with him, for that matter, some places where you will differ with me. And that is just fine. This is to be expected. To give you a tip-off, one of the areas where I find myself differing with Professor Breuggemann has to do with what he describes as his approach to the historicity of the biblical materials. You'll find in Chapter 1, which is entitled Imaginative Remembering, that as he seeks to understand, and this is vital, as Breuggemann seeks to understand what was the original intent of passages of the Hebrew Bible, that is the Old Testament, which portray past events, as he seeks to understand them as they were intended, he makes room for what he calls imaginative remembering. That, in fact, is a title of his first chapter, Imaginative Remembering. Here's what he's trying to say. In his understanding, if we were to replay a video of, if we were to somehow capture a particular event in Israel's history, which one shall we pick? Perhaps David and Goliath, or the coronation of David, or some aspect of the Exodus from Egypt. If we were somehow to capture a video of that and then put that alongside the biblical account, Walter Breuggemann would look at the two and say, well, it looks like there is some difference, and here's what I think has happened. I think that God has inspired the biblical writer to remember that event, but to remember it, shall we say, in, at times, a creative fashion, and what he calls an imaginative fashion. So this is how he approaches elements in the biblical account which he feels are not precisely historical in the sense of modern historiography or recording of writing. We'll probably have opportunity to delve into this more fully, and certainly Professor Breuggemann is correct in cautioning us against picking up Scripture, and if it tells us a story about ancient times, we want not to suppose that it was written with the same frame of reference for history writing, historiography, as if we were to pick up a modern history book, perhaps something about the economics of the U.S. in the first decade of the current millennium. If we were to pick up some chronicle of that, we would expect it to be, as much as possible, accurately representing everything that happened according to modern tenets of historiography. Certainly, Breuggemann is right. We shouldn't apply modern assumptions about history writing to ancient assumptions. Nevertheless, for my own position, I am less willing to give up details as being probably imaginative, less willing than Professor Breuggemann is. So there's a place where I would differ with him. I tend to rather approach biblical material as if it were innocent until proven guilty, historically reliable unless proven somehow to be otherwise. So what I like about Breuggemann, once again, is he has a broad mind. He's a brilliant writer, and he doesn't simply write for the erudite. He doesn't just write for the academy. He writes to confront us with the message, the theological message of Scripture, and does it with an expansive grasp of culture and history, global conditions, ancient conditions. He's a first-rate scholar, even though there are a few points and approaches with which I would differ. This volume, by the way, will proceed in a fairly book-by-book fashion through the Bible. Consequently, it will be our primary secondary text after Scripture itself. Ancient Israel's History, An Introduction to Issues and Sources, is edited by Bill Arnold and Richard Hess. Bill Arnold is a professor at Asbury Seminary, Richard Hess at Denver Seminary. And I have chosen this volume because it will zero in fact, on the same topic of history writing, historiography, and events in Israel's history that we were just talking about relative to Professor Breuggemann's approach. In fact, that's the main thing that this book will concentrate on. It will do so as a collection of essays. So, for example, I'm opening my own copy to the table of contents and see that the first essay, Chapter 1, is entitled The Genesis Narratives, and it was Bill Arnold of Asbury Seminary that contributed this one. And then Chapter 2 is an essay entitled The Exodus and Wilderness Narratives. Contributor here, I'm especially pleased to see that they were able to secure James Hoffmeyer as the contributor. As a young person, Professor Hoffmeyer grew up in Egypt, so he's at home in that environment, proceeded to get his PhD in historical studies relative to the Hebrew Bible, and now circles around to write about Egypt in the historical environment of Israel. So he's just excellent. I believe he's at Trinity. This volume provides us with, as it were, conversations with some experts in various portions of the Old Testament, but not dedicated to give us a Genesis to Malachi approach, book by book or chapter by chapter. Rather, it's topic by topic, roughly in a historical sequence. Now, I will find myself more in alignment with how these writers tend to handle the historical material when it's presented in Scripture. I'm a little closer to them, say, than I am to Breuggemann. That means that we're positioning this textbook in conversation with Breuggemann. Now, you or I may have points where in this textbook as well we will be at odds with them or differ, and that's just fine too. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to agree with me. What we want to do is learn to be careful and responsible scholars, aware of these issues, and not just simplistically making modern-day literature assumptions about what was actually written in the ancient framework according to literary conventions of ancient writing. So in a sense, this volume, Ancient Israel's History, will serve as a series of discussions on topics, admittedly by different writers, while the Breuggemann volume will give us one voice, Breuggemann's voice, running all the way through, and that gives us an important thread of consistency. Now with Arnold and Hess's edited volume, we'll talk with a variety of contributors, as if it were having a panel discussion almost, with a variety of experts, and it'll serve an important role in that regard. If you've taken a look at either of these, you've noticed that they are without illustration. The previous two are without illustration. And that is an important reason why we're including Karl Rasmussen's Zondervan Essential Atlas of the Bible to round out the list of textbooks. It's absolutely crucial to be able to picture, literally to visualize the territory where the events of Scripture happened. If you're talking about, for example, Israel making their way out of Egypt into Canaan, you want to have a rough sense of how far that is and what's the terrain, even exploring what were some of the reconstructed routes that they may have used. If we're talking about a particular city in Israel, we want to know, is it in the hinterland? Is it fairly remote? Or was it on one of the already established international trade routes? Routes that were traveled northward by the Egyptians, routes that were traveled southward by people in Syria or people coming from Babylon or Assyria. We want to be aware of what's going on in the land. And this is a beautifully produced resource. The photos will give you an ability to picture what terrain is like, and then the articles are valuable as well too, nicely written and fairly concise, so it'll be a quick read. I know you'll enjoy this as a complement to the more theological or philosophical or academic study of actual biblical text that is provided both by Breuggemann's volume and the edited work of Arnold and Hess. So I hope you get as much out of these textbooks as possible, and look forward to the contribution they make in your studies of this course.